The ice beneath Elena Vasquez's aircraft was cracking like gunshots in the Arctic silence. Through her windscreen, she could see the hairline fractures spreading outward from where her skis had touched down on what should have been solid frozen ground. Behind her, 6-year-old Tommy Brennan was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored, his small body fighting an infection that was winning. The nearest hospital was still 40 minutes away by air, but the lake ice wouldn't hold her plane for more than 60 seconds. In that moment, with death closing in from below and above, Elena made a decision that would define not just this day, but everything that came after. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Whitehorse Creek like a secret that refused to be told. Elena Vasquez stood on the wooden dock behind her cabin, coffee mug in hand, watching her de Havilland Beaver float plane bob gently in the calm water. The aircraft was 23 years old, painted in faded red and white stripes that had seen better decades, but Elena knew every rivet, every cable, every quirk in its temperament. She'd bought it 5 years ago with the last of her military separation pay, transforming it from a tired cargo hauler into something that could navigate Alaska's most unforgiving terrain. The town of Whitehorse Creek existed because of pilots like Elena. Nestled in a valley where 3 mountain ranges converged, it was unreachable by road for 8 months of the year. When winter locked the mountain passes with 20-foot snowdrifts, and spring floods washed out the single gravel highway, the only connection to the outside world came on wings. Mail, medicine, emergency supplies, and sometimes people who needed to disappear for a while. Elena carried it all without asking too many questions. Her charter service operated from a converted hangar that had once housed a mining company's aircraft back when copper was king in these mountains. The building was practical rather than pretty. Its corrugated metal walls painted a utilitarian green that had faded to the color of old sage. Inside, Elena maintained not just her own plane, but served as the unofficial mechanic for 3 other bush pilots who worked the region. Her tools were arranged with military precision, each wrench and socket in its designated place, each maintenance log updated to the hour. Elena herself was 34, with the kind of lean build that came from hauling cargo and climbing into tight engine compartments. Her black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her dark eyes held the steady focus of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions at low altitude in bad weather. She wore the unofficial uniform of Alaska bush pilots, worn jeans, steel-toed boots, and a flannel shirt under a jacket that had seen service in a dozen different aircraft over the years. The townspeople of Whitehorse Creek knew Elena as reliable, competent, and quietly private. She flew their sick to hospitals in Anchorage, brought their supplies when the roads were impassable, and occasionally ferried visitors who came to fish the pristine streams or hunt in the vast wilderness. What they didn't know was that before she'd become their lifeline to civilization, Elena Vasquez had been Captain Elena Vasquez of the 56th Arctic Rescue Squadron, one of the military's most elite cold-weather aviation units. For 8 years, she'd flown missions that required her to land aircraft in conditions that would terrify most pilots. Glacier rescues at 14,000 feet, medical evacuations in whiteout blizzards, and special operations insertions in terrain so remote it appeared on no civilian maps. Her military record contained commendations for flying into storms that had grounded every other aircraft, for finding landing zones where none should exist, and for bringing home people who everyone else had written off as lost. But military records also contained things that weren't commendations. Operation Clearwater had been classified so deeply that even Elena didn't know all the details. What she knew was that she'd been ordered to extract a research team from a glacier station in northern Canada, and when she'd arrived, she'd found evidence of experiments that violated every treaty governing Arctic research. The extraction had Gone wrong, shots had been fired, and when Elena had landed her helicopter on a Canadian military base to seek help for her wounded passengers, she'd found herself under arrest for international espionage. The charges had been dropped after 6 months of legal proceedings that took place behind closed doors. But Elena's military career was over. The official story was that she'd requested discharge to pursue civilian opportunities. The unofficial story was that she knew too much about things that important people preferred to keep buried under Arctic ice. Her separation package had been generous enough to buy silence, but not generous enough to buy forgiveness for the friends who died because someone had given her incomplete information about what she was really extracting. So Elena had taken her helicopter experience, her knowledge of mountain flying, and her need to disappear from official radar, and had come to Whitehorse Creek. The town needed a pilot. She needed a place where nobody asked about her past, and the arrangement had worked perfectly for 5 years. She flew scheduled runs to Anchorage twice a week, emergency medical flights whenever needed, and cargo runs to smaller settlements scattered throughout the region. It was honest work, necessary work, and it let her sleep at night without wondering what classified operations were being launched using her flight plans. Her daily routine had the comforting predictability of a well-maintained engine. Every morning at 6, she'd inspect her aircraft, checking oil levels, testing control surfaces, and reviewing weather reports with the thoroughness that had kept her alive through hundreds of dangerous flights. She'd monitor emergency frequencies while drinking her coffee, ready to respond if someone in the vast wilderness needed help. Most days were routine mail runs, supply flights, the occasional tourist who wanted to see untouched country from the air. But Elena's radio equipment was more sophisticated than what most bush pilots carried. Hidden among the standard aviation transceivers were encrypted communication devices that monitored military and emergency service frequencies across Alaska and northern Canada. She told herself it was just staying informed about weather and air traffic, but the truth was more complicated. Old habits died hard, and Elena had learned that information could mean the difference between life and death in situations where official channels moved too slowly. The hangar walls were decorated with aviation charts showing every airstrip, lake, and emergency landing zone within 500 miles. Elena had personally flown to most of them, noting wind patterns, terrain hazards, and seasonal access issues in margins filled with her careful handwriting. To visitors, it looked like the workspace of a thorough professional. To Elena, it was a survival tool, detailed intelligence about the country she'd need to know if she ever had to disappear completely. Her aircraft reflected the same attention to detail. The Beaver's engine had been completely rebuilt with modifications that weren't in any manual. The avionics package included GPS systems with military-grade encryption, weather radar capable of penetrating Arctic storms, and communication equipment that could reach satellites when ground-based radio failed. The cargo compartment could be reconfigured in minutes to carry medical equipment, emergency supplies, or passengers who needed to travel without appearing on passenger manifests. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More than anything, Elena had built a web of trust across the region, earned not through charm or curiosity, but through skill and dependability. Dr. Marcus Reed at the remote clinic 40 miles north knew that when Elena said she could fly in questionable weather, she meant it. Jake Morrison, who delivered supplies to remote mining sites, trusted her flight schedule more than the rising sun. Chief Robert Hayes of the Alaska State Troopers knew she could be counted on to carry sensitive cargo without prying into the coup. Details. These relationships hadn't formed overnight. They were built flight by flight, favor by favor, over 5 steady years. To those who knew her, Elena Vasquez was exactly what she appeared, a capable, no-nonsense bush pilot who kept her word and minded her own business. Whatever she'd been in a former life was buried so deep that even she rarely thought about it anymore. That October morning, with winter closing in and early season storms stirring in the mountains, Elena was focused on her maintenance log, planning improvements for her aircraft before the freeze set in. The Beaver's engine was running perfectly, but she'd identified a few upgrades to boost performance in the cold and increase her range for emergency flights. Solving these types of mechanical problems had always been satisfying, taking something good and making it better through careful planning and technical precision. Her radio murmured in the background with the usual chatter weather updates, aircraft check-ins, the daily call from the medical station. She listened with half an ear while reviewing parts lists and flight records. It was quiet, satisfying work, the kind that kept her focused on things she could control rather than the past. But quiet never lasted long out here. Elena had learned that in her military days, and bush flying had only reinforced it. The Alaskan wilderness was breathtaking, but it had no patience for human error. The weather could shift from calm to catastrophic in minutes. Small mechanical issues could become fatal when help was hours away, and sometimes the past resurfaced in unexpected ways. With her coffee finished, she began her routine inspection of the Beaver, running her hands along its surfaces, checking for wear or damage. The aircraft felt familiar and steady, like a trusted partner ready for whatever the day might bring. She had no idea that before nightfall, she'd be flying headlong into the worst storm of the season, fighting to save a child's life, and forced to confront a part of herself she thought she'd left behind. That life-changing radio call was still hours away. For now, in the pale Arctic morning, with her plane prepped and her instincts sharp, Elena Vasquez was exactly where she belonged, on the frontier, ready for whatever challenge came next. At 9:15, the hangar phone rang sharp and sudden, slicing through the quiet. Elena answered quickly, expecting a routine call. Instead, Dr. Marcus Reed's voice came through tight with urgency, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. "Elena, I need a medevac immediately. 6-year-old boy, serious infection, he's going into septic shock. His mom brought him in from the Brennan place this morning. I've done what I can, but he needs surgery within hours or he won't make it." She was already grabbing her flight gear before he finished. Medical emergencies were part of the job, but something in Reed's voice told her this one was different. "What's your weather like?" she asked, glancing at the storm radar. "I'm seeing systems building out west. It's bad and getting worse. Visibility's dropping. Winds are coming up." "But Elena, he doesn't have time. I've stabilized him for now, but if he doesn't get to a hospital soon." His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Elena double-checked her instruments. The storm was definitely moving in, the kind that would keep most pilots grounded. But this was exactly why she flew the Beaver, and she'd been through worse. "I'll be airborne in 10. Be ready to load." As she ran through her pre-flight checks, her mind worked ahead. Under normal weather, the trip to Kodiak Medical would take 40 minutes. But with the storm pushing in, she'd need to detour through mountain passes, stretching out the flight time they didn't have. The most direct route crossed frozen Lake Talkeetna, but the early ice likely wasn't solid enough for a safe emergency landing if something went wrong. Still, as the Beaver's engine came to life and vibrated beneath her, Elena made the kind of calculated decision she'd built her career on. Calculated risks were part of the job, and a child's life was worth taking chances that would be foolish under any other circumstances. She'd flown through worse storms and landed in more dangerous places. This was just another day in the life of a bush pilot who understood that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to being willing to fly when everyone else stayed on the ground. The takeoff from Whitehorse Creek was routine, but as Elena climbed toward the mountains, she could see the storm building like a wall of gray death on the horizon. She had perhaps an hour before conditions became impossible, which should be enough time to reach the medical station and deliver young Tommy Brennan to the care he needed. It was going to be close, but Elena had built her reputation on making flights that were supposed to be impossible. What she couldn't see, as she flew toward her appointment with destiny, was the series of events already in motion that would transform a routine medical evacuation into something far more dangerous. Forces from her military past were converging on this remote corner of Alaska, and the storm that threatened to ground her aircraft was about to become the least of her problems. The flight to Dr. Reed's clinic took Elena through terrain that would have challenged seasoned mountain pilots even in perfect weather. The Beaver responded to her touch with the reliability of an aircraft that had been maintained beyond factory specifications, its engine note steady despite the turbulence that was beginning to build as the storm system approached. Below her, the Alaska wilderness stretched endlessly in shades of gold and brown, autumn having painted the landscape with colors that would soon disappear under winter's white blanket. Elena monitored multiple radio frequencies as she flew, keeping one ear on weather updates while scanning emergency channels for any signs that this medical evacuation might be more complicated than it appeared. 5 years of bush flying had taught her that simple flights had a way of becoming complex when you least expected it, and something about Dr. Reed's tone had suggested undercurrents she didn't fully understand. The clinic sat on a plateau overlooking the Susitna River, accessible only by aircraft or a hiking trail that became impassable when snow began to fall. Dr. Reed had established the facility 3 years ago to serve the scattered homesteads and mining operations in the region, and Elena had flown him supplies and equipment dozens of times. He was competent, unflappable, and not given to panic calls unless the situation was genuinely dire. As Elena approached the clinic's landing strip, she could see Dr. Reed waiting beside a small figure on a stretcher. Even from altitude, she could tell that Tommy Brennan was in serious trouble. The boy's mother, Lisa Brennan, stood beside the stretcher with the rigid posture of someone holding herself together through sheer willpower. Elena had flown Lisa and her husband to town several times over the years, and she knew them as hardworking people who had carved out a difficult life in one of Alaska's most remote valleys. The landing was textbook perfect, despite crosswinds that were beginning to gust as the storm approached. Elena taxied close to the clinic and shut down the engine, immediately converting the Beaver's cabin for medical transport. She'd performed this reconfiguration dozens of times, securing the stretcher brackets and ensuring that Dr. Reed would have access to his patient during the flight. "How is he?" Elena asked as they loaded Tommy into the aircraft. The boy was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, his small face flushed with fever that spoke of infection overwhelming his system. Dr. Reed checked Tommy's vital signs one more time before securing him for transport. "Appendicitis that went septic. The infection has spread throughout his abdominal cavity, and his body is going into shock. I've got him on antibiotics and fluids, but he needs surgery within the next 2 hours, or we're going to lose him." Lisa Brennan climbed into the passenger seat, her face pale but determined. "He was complaining about stomach pain yesterday, but we thought it was just something he ate. This morning he could barely stand up." Her voice carried the guilt that every parent felt when their child was seriously ill, the terrible knowledge that symptoms they'd dismissed as minor had been warning signs of something life-threatening. Elena performed her pre-flight checks with extra care, knowing that engine failure during this flight would be catastrophic. The storm was building faster than predicted, and the direct route to Kodiak Medical Station would take them over increasingly dangerous terrain. But the alternative routes would add 30 minutes to the flight time, and Dr. Reed had made it clear that Tommy didn't have 30 minutes to spare. As the Beaver lifted off from the clinic's runway, Elena made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of taking the safer route through the mountain valleys, she would fly direct over frozen Lake Talkeetna, cutting 20 minutes from the flight time, but risking a crossing over ice that might not be solid enough to support an emergency. Landing. The first part of the flight proceeded normally, with Elena maintaining altitude and speed while Dr. Reed monitored Tommy's condition in the back. The boy's vital signs were weakening, but he was holding on, fighting an infection that would have killed an adult in his condition. Lisa sat rigidly in the passenger seat, watching the wilderness pass below while silently willing her son to survive until they reached help. But as they approached the mountain pass that would take them over frozen Lake Talkeetna, Elena's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission on a frequency she hadn't monitored in 5 years. The voice was encrypted, but Elena's military training allowed her to recognize the basic structure of a tactical communication, even if she couldn't decode the specifics. She switched to her military monitoring equipment, devices that officially didn't exist, but that she'd maintained out of old habits and newer paranoia. What she heard made her blood run cold. Multiple aircraft were operating in the area under call signs that suggested special operations activity. The transmissions were brief and professional, but Elena's experience told her that someone was conducting a mission in exactly the airspace she needed to cross. "Dr. Reed," Elena called back to the cabin, "I'm picking up military traffic in our flight path. We may need to alter course." "How much time would that add?" Dr. Reed's voice was tight with concern. Elena checked her navigation displays. 40 minutes minimum, maybe more if we have to circumnavigate whatever operation they're running. Dr. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came back with the flat certainty of someone who'd made difficult decisions in emergency situations. "He won't survive that long. We have to go direct." Elena nodded, understanding the calculation. Sometimes in aviation, as in medicine, you had to choose between a certain bad outcome and a risky chance at success. She adjusted her heading toward frozen Lake Talkeetna, monitoring the military frequencies while scanning the sky for any sign of other aircraft. The storm was building faster than the weather services had predicted, with visibility dropping and winds increasing to levels that would challenge even her heavily modified Beaver. But Elena had flown through worse conditions during her military years, and the aircraft was performing flawlessly despite the turbulence that was making Dr. Reed's work more difficult in the cabin. As they approached the lake, Elena could see that her gamble was about to be tested. The ice looked solid from altitude, but early season conditions were always uncertain. More importantly, she could see helicopter activity on the far shore. Military aircraft that shouldn't have been operating in civilian airspace without proper notifications. That's when her radio exploded with activity on frequencies that brought back memories Elena had spent 5 years trying to forget. The transmissions were encrypted, but the urgency in the voices was unmistakable. Someone was in trouble down there, and the helicopters were conducting what sounded like a search and rescue operation that had gone wrong. Elena's training kicked in automatically. She recognized the tactical situation developing below as the kind of operation she'd flown countless times during her military career. Special operations personnel were in distress, weather was deteriorating rapidly, and the available rescue assets were insufficient for the conditions. It was exactly the kind of scenario that had once required her unique combination of flying skills and willingness to operate in impossible conditions. But Elena Vasquez was no longer Captain Vasquez of the 56th Arctic Rescue Squadron. She was a civilian bush pilot with a dying child on board, flying through a storm that was rapidly becoming unsurvivable. Her obligation was to Tommy Brennan and his mother, not to whoever was conducting classified operations in the wilderness below. The decision should have been simple. But as Elena flew over frozen Lake Talkeetna, she saw something that changed everything. On the ice below, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a figure in military gear waving frantically at her aircraft. Someone was down on the lake, separated from the helicopters by weather that was grounding even military rescue assets. Elena's radio crackled with a transmission on an emergency frequency she hadn't used in years. The voice was familiar, although she couldn't immediately place it. "Aircraft overhead, this is Kodiak Base emergency. We have personnel stranded on the ice. Can you assist?" Dr. Reed heard the transmission and understood immediately what Elena was facing. "Elena, we can't stop. Tommy is running out of time." Lisa Brennan turned in her seat, her eyes reflecting the terrible understanding that someone else's emergency was colliding with her son's crisis. "Please," she whispered. "He's all we have." Elena stared down at the figure on the ice then. Back at her navigation display showing the route to Kodiak Medical Station. In her military career, she'd never faced a situation where saving one life meant abandoning another. But bush flying in Alaska was full of impossible choices, and this was the worst one she'd ever encountered. The storm was intensifying, visibility was dropping toward zero, and her fuel was burning faster than planned due to the headwinds. Even if she wanted to help the stranded person below, landing on uncertain ice in these conditions would risk all their lives. But the military training that had saved dozens of lives during her career was screaming at her to attempt a rescue that civilian logic said was impossible. That's when Elena's encrypted radio received a message that changed everything. The transmission was brief, coded, but unmistakably directed at her. "Valkyrie, this is Phoenix. We know you're up there. Jake Morrison is on that ice, and he's not going to survive another hour in this storm." Jake Morrison, Elena's former squadron leader, the man who'd trained her in high-altitude rescue operations, who'd recommended her for the missions that had defined her military career. Jake was the one person from her past who'd tried to help during the legal proceedings that had ended her military service, and he was down on the ice dying while she flew overhead with the power to save him. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Tommy Brennan was dying in her cabin, needing immediate medical attention that only existed at Kodiak Medical Station. Jake Morrison was dying on the ice below, needing extraction that only she had the skills to provide in these conditions. And somewhere in the storm, whoever had used her old call sign was manipulating the situation in ways she didn't understand. Dr. Reed's voice came from the cabin, tight with professional urgency. "Elena, his blood pressure is dropping. We're losing him." Elena looked down at the ice one more time, seeing Jake's figure barely visible through the snow. Then she keyed her radio with a decision that would haunt her regardless of which choice she made. "Kodiak Base. This is civilian aircraft November 7-4 Victor. I have a medical emergency on board requiring immediate hospital attention. I cannot assist with surface rescue at this time." The silence on the radio was deafening. Elena knew that by flying past Jake Morrison, she was condemning a friend to death in the Arctic wilderness. But Tommy Brennan was 6 years old, and his only crime was being born into a family that lived beyond the reach of immediate medical care. Elena adjusted her heading toward Kodiak Medical Station, pushing the Beaver through turbulence that was testing the limits of even her modified aircraft. Behind her, Dr. Reed worked frantically to keep Tommy alive while Lisa Brennan sat in frozen silence, understanding that her son's life had been purchased with someone else's death. But as Elena flew away from frozen Lake Talkeetna, her military-grade RDIO equipment picked up transmissions that suggested the situation below was more complex than a simple search and rescue operation. The voices on the encrypted channels spoke of asset recovery and containment protocols, language that belonged to intelligence operations rather than emergency rescues. Elena realized with growing unease that Jake Morrison's presence on the ice might not have been accidental. Someone had known she would be flying this route, had known she would monitor military frequencies, and had known exactly how to manipulate her into an impossible situation. The question was whether Jake was a genuine victim or bait in a trap, designed to force her back into a world she'd spent 5 years escaping. 20 minutes later, Elena landed at Kodiak Medical Station in conditions that should have been impossible. The storm had reduced visibility to near zero, and crosswinds were gusting above safe limits for aircraft operations. But the Beaver touched down on the medical station's runway like it had been designed for exactly these conditions. Elena's military training and 5 years of bush flying combining to achieve what should have been impossible. The medical team was waiting, and Tommy Brennan was rushed into surgery within minutes of landing. Dr. Reed squeezed Elena's shoulder as they wheeled the boy away. "You made the right choice," he said quietly. "That kid is alive because you were willing to fly in conditions that would have grounded anyone else." But as Elena watched Tommy disappear into the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been manipulated into abandoning Jake Morrison. Someone had known her flight route, had known about Tommy's medical emergency, and had used both to place her in a situation where any choice she made would serve their purposes. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission on a secure channel that only 3 people in the world should have known about. The voice was unfamiliar, but the authority was unmistakable. "Captain Vasquez, this is Colonel Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to talk." Elena stared at the radio, feeling the past reaching across 5 years of carefully constructed anonymity to reclaim her. Whatever had happened to Jake Morrison on frozen Lake Talkeetna, it was connected to operations that she'd thought were buried under layers of classification and official denial. The storm was intensifying outside, grounding all aircraft and cutting off communication with the outside world. Elena was trapped at Kodiak Medical Station with questions that had no good answers and the growing certainty that saving Tommy Brennan had been only the beginning of a situation that threatened to destroy everything she'd built in Alaska. The real battle was about to begin, and Elena Vasquez was no longer sure which side she was supposed to be fighting for. Colonel Harrison materialized at Kodiak Medical Station like a ghost from Alana's classified past, arriving in a military helicopter that had somehow managed to land in conditions that should have been impossible. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd spent decades making decisions that affected people's lives in ways they'd never know about. When he walked into the station's small waiting room where Elena sat drinking coffee and watching snow pile up against the windows, she knew immediately that her 5 years of anonymity were over. "Captain Vasquez," he said, settling into a chair across from her with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Or should I say Elena Vasquez, bush pilot and entrepreneur?" Elena didn't respond immediately, studying Harrison's face for clues about what kind of trouble she was facing. Defense Intelligence Agency meant operations that existed in the shadows between military action and political deniability, the kind of work that created problems requiring people like her to solve them. "I'm not Captain Anything anymore," Elena said finally. "I'm a civilian pilot with a charter service, and I just saved a kid's life. Whatever you think I can do for you, you're wrong." Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Jake Morrison is dead. His body was recovered from frozen Lake Talkeetna 3 hours ago, frozen solid in gear that suggests he'd been on the ice for at least 6 hours before you flew over." The information hit Elena like a physical blow. If Jake had been dead for 6 hours before her flight, then the figure she'd seen waving from the ice hadn't been Jake at all. Someone had used her friend's identity to manipulate her into an impossible choice, knowing she would fly past rather than risk Tommy's life for what appeared to be a hopeless rescue. "Who was on the ice?" Elena asked, her voice carefully controlled. Harrison consulted a tablet, scrolling through information that was clearly classified well above Elena's former clearance level. "David Cross, formerly Captain Cross of your old unit. He's been selling classified information about Arctic rescue operations to foreign intelligence services. We've been tracking him for months, but he's proven remarkably elusive." Elena felt pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place with disturbing clarity. David Cross had been the most ambitious officer in the 56th Arctic Rescue Squadron, always pushing for advancement and recognition. During Operation Clearwater, he'd been the one who'd briefed her on the mission parameters, providing the incomplete information that had led to the disaster that ended her military career. Cross set this up, Elena realized. He knew I'd be flying this route because of the medical emergency. He used Jake's identity to try to force me into landing, probably so he could hijack my aircraft and escape. Harrison nodded approvingly. Cross has been monitoring emergency radio frequencies, looking for opportunities to commandeer civilian aircraft for extraction. Your flight today presented the perfect opportunity, a pilot with the skills to operate in impossible conditions. Flying an aircraft capable of reaching destinations beyond our interdiction capability. Elena stood up and walked to the window, watching the storm rage outside while processing the implications of what Harrison was telling her. Cross had been willing to let a 6-year-old boy die if it meant securing his escape route. The callousness of using a child's medical emergency as cover for espionage operations went beyond anything she'd encountered during her military career. "What do you want from me?" Elena asked without turning around. "Cross isn't finished," Harrison said. "Our intelligence indicates he has one more transaction scheduled, a final sale of classified Arctic warfare protocols to buyers who intend to use them against American interests. The meeting is supposed to take place at a location only he knows, using transportation assets he's already arranged." Elena turned back to face Harrison, seeing the inevitable request forming in his expression. "You want me to help you catch him. We want you to be the bait that draws him out into the open." Harrison set his tablet aside and leaned forward slightly. "Cross knows your capabilities, knows your aircraft, and knows you're operating in this region. If we can convince him that you're available for charter, he'll try to hire you for his final extraction." Elena shook her head immediately. "I'm not military anymore. I don't work for agencies that manipulate medical emergencies to test civilian responses. Find someone else." Harrison's expression hardened slightly. "Cross has killed at least 4 people to protect his operation, including Jake Morrison. He's planning to sell information that will compromise Arctic rescue operations for the next decade. American personnel will die because of what he's selling." The moral pressure was unmistakable, but Elena had spent 5 years learning to resist exactly this kind of recruitment pitch. She'd walked away from the military because of operations that blurred the lines between legitimate missions and political expedience, and she wasn't interested in being drawn back into that world. But as Elena prepared to refuse Harrison's request, definitively, Dr. Reed appeared in the waiting room with news that changed everything. "Elena, I need to talk to you privately." They stepped into an empty examination room, where Dr. Reed's expression was troubled in ways that suggested medical complications beyond normal surgical risks. "Tommy's surgery went well," he said, "but we found something during the procedure that's very concerning." Elena waited, dreading whatever additional crisis was about to complicate an already impossible situation. "The infection wasn't natural," Dr. Reed continued. "Laboratory analysis shows traces of bacterial agents that don't occur in normal appendicitis cases. Someone deliberately infected that boy with a weaponized pathogen designed to cause exactly the kind of systemic failure we've been treating." The revelation hit Elena like Arctic wind, cold and devastating in its implications. Tommy Brennan hadn't suffered a random medical emergency. He'd been deliberately poisoned as part of a plan that required Elena to be flying over Frozen Lake Talkeetna at a specific time. "Cross," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her like nausea. "He infected Tommy to force me into the air when he needed extraction." Dr. Reed nodded grimly. "The pathogen was administered approximately 18 hours ago, with a progression timeline calculated to produce maximum symptoms this morning. Someone with sophisticated medical knowledge planned this entire scenario." Elena felt rage building in her chest, a cold fury that she hadn't experienced since her military career ended. Cross hadn't just used a medical emergency as cover for his espionage activities. He'd deliberately caused a child's life-threatening illness, calculating that Elena's reputation for flying impossible rescue missions would put her in the right place at the right time. She returned to the waiting room where Harrison waited, with the patient expression of someone who'd anticipated exactly this development. "You knew," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We suspected," Harrison admitted. "Cross has used similar tactics before, manufacturing emergencies that require specific responses from targeted individuals. We couldn't prove it until Dr. Reed's analysis confirmed the bacterial agents." Elena stared at Harrison, understanding that she'd been manipulated by both sides of this operation. Cross had poisoned a child to create the circumstances he needed, while Harrison had withheld crucial information to ensure Elena would make the choices that served his agenda. "Tommy will recover completely," Dr. Reed said, sensing Elena's internal struggle. The pathogen was designed to be treatable once properly diagnosed, but without immediate surgical intervention, he would have died. Elena looked out at the storm, knowing that somewhere in the wilderness, Cross was preparing for his final transaction while believing he'd successfully manipulated her into being available for extraction. The calculated cruelty of poisoning a 6-year-old boy to create a distraction demanded a response that went beyond official channels or bureaucratic justice. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Elena asked Harrison. Harrison consulted his tablet again, scrolling to operational details that carried classification markings Elena hadn't seen in 5 years. "Cross believes you're unaware of his involvement in today's events. He'll contact you within the next 12 hours, requesting emergency transport to a location where he can complete his final transaction. We want you to accept the charter and fly him to coordinates we'll provide." Elena understood immediately what Harrison wasn't saying explicitly. The coordinates wouldn't be Cross's intended destination. They would be a location where Defense Intelligence Agency personnel could arrest him without the complications of international jurisdiction or diplomatic immunity. "A trap," Elena said. "Justice," Harrison corrected. "Cross has betrayed his country, murdered his former colleagues, and used a child's life as leverage in an espionage operation. He deserves whatever consequences his choices have earned." Elena walked back to the window, watching the storm that had trapped them all at Kodiak Medical Station while she wrestled with a decision that would define who she chose to be. 5 years ago, she'd walked away from exactly this kind of operation, refusing to participate in activities that treated human lives as acceptable losses in larger political games. But Cross had crossed lines that went beyond military ethics or political expedience. He'd poisoned a 6-year-old boy, calculating that Elena's protective instincts would place her exactly where he needed her to be. The personal nature of the attack, combined with the callous manipulation of a child suffering, demanded a response that transcended her usual reluctance to become involved in intelligence operations. "If I do this," Elena said finally, "I do it my way. No backup, no surveillance, no government interference. Cross gets delivered to your people, but I choose how and when." Harrison smiled, recognizing the commitment he'd been working toward since his arrival, agreed. "But understand that Cross is extremely dangerous. He's killed to protect his operation before, and he'll kill again if he suspects a trap." Elena turned back to face Harrison, and for the first time since leaving the military, she allowed her expression to show the cold competence that had made her one of the most effective rescue pilots in Arctic warfare history. "Colonel, I've been flying impossible missions in deadly conditions for over a decade. David Cross is about to discover that some people can't be manipulated, can't be intimidated, and can't be stopped when they decide someone needs to answer for their crimes." The storm continued to rage outside, but Elena was no longer thinking about weather or flying conditions. She was thinking about justice, revenge, and the satisfaction of ensuring that Cross's final transaction would be with consequences he'd never planned to face. The quiet bush pilot who'd spent 5 years avoiding her past was about to become someone far more dangerous. Cross contacted Elena at exactly 3:47 a.m., his voice crackling through radio static that suggested he was transmitting from a location with marginal communication capability. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystal-clear skies and temperatures that would challenge even Elena's cold weather flying experience. But Cross sounded like a man under pressure who couldn't afford to wait for better conditions. "Elena, this is Dave Cross. I need emergency charter service. Departure as soon as possible. Destination to be provided after takeoff. Standard rates plus 50% hazard pay, cash on delivery." Elena had been waiting for the call, but hearing Cross's voice after 5 years brought back memories of Operation Clearwater and the colleagues who'd died because of his incomplete briefings. She kept her voice professionally neutral, giving no indication that she knew about his espionage activities or his role in Tommy's poisoning. "What's the nature of the emergency, Mr. Cross? Weather conditions are still marginal, and I need to know what I'm flying into." Cross's transmission carried the edge of someone who'd been planning this conversation carefully. Research equipment recovery from a remote station. Time-sensitive biological samples that need to reach laboratory facilities within 8 hours, or they'll be worthless. Elena understood immediately that Cross was using language designed to appeal to her reputation for flying medical and scientific missions in impossible conditions. He was counting on her professional pride and humanitarian instincts to overcome any reluctance about flying in dangerous weather. "Departure point?" Elena asked, checking her navigation equipment while Harrison monitored the conversation from across the room. "Abandoned airstrip at grid reference 77 Mike, Quebec. I'll have coordinates and payment ready when you arrive." Elena knew the location, a gravel strip, built by mining operations in the 1970s and abandoned when the copper played out. It was exactly the kind of remote site that would appeal to someone conducting activities he didn't want observed by official aviation traffic control. "I can be airborne in 30 minutes, Elena said. "But fuel costs extra in these conditions. And I'll need full payment before departure." Cross's agreement was immediate, confirming Elena's suspicion that he was desperate enough to accept any terms that got him out of Alaska quickly. After ending the radio contact, Elena turned to Co. Harrison with the cold smile of someone who just committed to a course of action that couldn't be reversed. "He's at the old Denali mining strip, probably with transportation arranged to get him out of the country once I deliver him to his intended destination," Elena said, beginning her pre-flight preparations with the methodical efficiency that had characterized her military career. Harrison consulted his tactical displays, showing satellite coverage of the region where Cross was waiting. "Our assets are positioned along likely escape routes, but if he reaches international waters or crosses into Canadian airspace, apprehension becomes much more complicated." Elena nodded, understanding the political constraints that governed Harrison's operation. Cross had chosen his extraction timing carefully, knowing that bad weather and remote locations would limit official response capabilities. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed Elena would remain ignorant of his role in recent events. The flight to the abandoned mining strip took Elena through some of the most spectacular and dangerous terrain in North America. Dawn was breaking over peaks that reached toward 14,000 feet, painting snow-covered ridges in shades of gold and pink that would have been breathtaking under any other circumstances. But Elena's attention was focused on the complex, tactical situation developing ahead, where she would need to maintain her cover as an unwitting charter pilot while positioning Cross for capture. The Beaver performed flawlessly despite temperatures that challenged every system on the aircraft. Elena's modifications proved their worth as she navigated through mountain passes where normal aircraft would have suffered engine failure or control problems. The aircraft responded to her touch with the precision of a finely tuned instrument, giving her confidence that whatever happened at the mining strip, she would have the performance capability to handle it. As Elena approached the abandoned airfield, she could see Cross waiting beside a military-style tent that suggested he'd been camping at the location for several days. He was alone, which surprised Elena until she realized that his espionage operation required him to minimize witnesses to his final transaction. Anyone who could testify about his activities represented a potential security risk he couldn't afford. The landing on the gravel strip was routine despite crosswinds that would have challenged less experienced pilots. Elena taxied close to Cross's position and shut down the engine, immediately beginning the process of loading whatever cargo he wanted to transport. Her movements were casual and professional, giving no indication that she knew anything beyond what he'd told her about research. Equipment recovery. Cross approached the aircraft with the confidence of someone accustomed to manipulating situations to his advantage. He was older than Elena remembered, with the kind of weathered appearance that suggested years of operating in harsh conditions. But his eyes held the cold calculation she remembered from their military service together, the look of someone who viewed other people as assets to be used rather than colleagues to be trusted. "Elena, good to see you again," Cross said, loading a sealed case into the Beaver's cargo compartment. "I appreciate you taking this charter on short notice." Elena accepted the case while scanning Cross's equipment for any indication of weapons or additional personnel. He appeared to be traveling alone, but her military experience had taught her that appearances could be deliberately deceiving. "Where are we headed?" Elena asked, settling into the pilot's seat while Cross secured himself in the passenger position. Cross handed her a GPS coordinate display showing a location approximately 200 miles north, near the Canadian border. "Private airstrip, very discreet operation. The people I'm meeting prefer to avoid official attention." Elena programmed the coordinates into her navigation system, while noting that the destination was within 50 miles of the location Harrison had specified for Cross's arrest. Either the Defense Intelligence Agency had excellent intelligence about Cross's plans, or they were positioning their trap exactly where Cross expected to complete his transaction. The takeoff proceeded normally, with Cross apparently relaxed and confident about his extraction plan. But as they climbed toward cruising altitude, Elena noticed that he was monitoring multiple communication devices, suggesting that his operation involved coordination with personnel she hadn't seen. 20 minutes into the flight, Cross's demeanor began to change. He was studying the terrain below with the attention of someone who recognized that they weren't following the most direct route to their destination. Elena had been steadily altering course toward Harrison's coordinates, but Cross's military training was allowing him to detect the deception. "Elena," Cross said carefully, "this doesn't look like the route I calculated for our destination." Elena maintained her professional pilot voice while feeling tension building in the cockpit. "Weather radar is showing turbulence along the direct route. I'm taking us around the worst of it." Cross consulted his own GPS device, comparing it to Elena's navigation display. The discrepancy was becoming too obvious to explain away with weather considerations, and Elena could see suspicion hardening in his expression. "Change course to the original heading," Cross said, his voice carrying the authority he'd used during their military service. "I need to be at those coordinates within the next hour." Elena knew that the moment of decision had arrived. She could continue the deception and hope to reach Harrison's people before Cross realized he was being delivered to a trap, or she could reveal her knowledge of his activities and force a confrontation at altitude in an aircraft that would become uncontrollable if violence erupted in the cockpit. "I can't do that, Dave," Elena said quietly, allowing her voice to carry the steel that had once made her one of the military's most feared rescue pilots. "You're not going to make your transaction. You're going to answer for what you've done." Cross's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged toward the control panel, trying to force Elena to change course while reaching for what appeared to be a weapon concealed in his jacket. But Elena had anticipated exactly this response, and her counterattack was faster and more decisive than Cross had expected. The struggle in the cockpit lasted only seconds, but it occurred at 8,000 feet in an aircraft that required constant pilot attention to remain airborne. Elena managed to maintain control while subduing Cross, but not before he succeeded in damaging critical navigation equipment that left them flying without reliable position information. As Elena zip-tied Cross's hands behind his back with restraints she'd brought specifically for this possibility, she realized that their situation had become significantly more dangerous. The damaged navigation equipment meant she was flying on dead reckoning in terrain where small navigation errors could result in controlled flight into mountainous ground. "You have no idea what you've interfered with," Cross said, his voice tight with pain and frustration. "That information I'm carrying could save American lives." Elena laughed grimly, adjusting course toward what she hoped was Harrison's interception. "Point. The only American lives you're interested in saving are your own. Jake Morrison is dead because of your operation, and you poisoned a 6-year-old boy to create the distraction you needed." Cross's expression showed genuine surprise, suggesting that he hadn't expected Elena to discover his role in Tommy's illness. "The boy will recover completely. The pathogen was designed to be treatable." "You calculated that I would risk everything to save a dying child," Elena said, feeling anger building in her voice. "You used my reputation against me, knowing I'd fly in impossible conditions if it meant getting Tommy to medical care." Cross nodded with the casual admission of someone who viewed manipulation as a professional skill. "Your humanitarian instincts made you predictable, but you've ruined everything by interfering with my extraction." Elena keyed her radio, broadcasting on the emergency frequency Harrison was monitoring. "Phoenix Base, this is November 7. 4 Victor. Package is secured, but navigation equipment is damaged. Request vector to pickup point." Harrison's response was immediate and professional. "November 7 4 Victor. Turn left heading 270. Maintain current altitude. Friendly aircraft will intercept in 15 minutes. As Elena adjusted course toward the interception point, she realized that her role in Cross's capture was almost complete. But something in his demeanor suggested that he wasn't finished fighting. Despite being restrained and at 8,000 feet in an aircraft he couldn't control. "Elena," Cross said quietly, "you should know that this operation is bigger than just me. The people I work for don't accept failure, and they don't leave loose ends." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air temperature. If Cross was part of a larger espionage network, then capturing him might only be the beginning of a much more dangerous situation. The interception with Harrison's aircraft occurred exactly as planned, with military helicopters taking custody of Cross and his classified materials while Elena continued to Kodiak Medical Station to check on Tommy's recovery. But as she flew back through the Alaska wilderness, Elena couldn't shake Cross's warning about loose ends and people who didn't accept failure. She'd thought that delivering Cross to justice would end her involvement in whatever operation had brought him to Alaska. Instead, she was beginning to understand that she'd stepped into a situation that was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had told her. The quiet life she'd built in Whitehorse Creek was about to be tested by forces that viewed her as either an asset to be recruited or a threat to be eliminated. The real battle was just beginning, and Elena Vasquez was no longer sure who she could trust in a game where the stakes were measured in national security and human lives. The hangar at Kodiak Medical Station buzzed with activity that belonged to military operations rather than civilian health care. Elena watched through the window as personnel in unmarked fatigues offloaded equipment from helicopters that bore no identification markings, their movements suggesting the kind of urgency that accompanied classified missions. Colonel Harrison stood beside her, observing the deployment with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was finally coming to fruition. "Cross was carrying more than we anticipated," Harrison said, consulting updates on his encrypted tablet. His final transaction involved selling complete Arctic warfare protocols to a consortium that includes representatives from 3 hostile nations. The intelligence he was carrying could have compromised American operations across the entire polar region. Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on Tommy Brennan's room, where the boy was recovering from surgery with a resilience that amazed the medical staff. Dr. Reed had confirmed that the bacterial infection was completely under control, and Tommy would suffer no lasting effects from Cross's calculated poisoning. Lisa Brennan sat beside her son's bed, reading stories in a voice that still carried the tremor of someone who'd nearly lost everything that mattered. The sight of Tommy recovering strengthened Elena's resolve in ways that surprised her. During her military career, she'd rescued dozens of people from impossible situations, but those operations had been abstract exercises in tactical flying and emergency procedures. Saving Tommy had been personal, immediate, and connected to the kind of life she'd chosen to build in Alaska. Cross's willingness to poison a child to manipulate her demonstrated a level of cruelty that demanded consequences beyond official justice. "What happens now?" Elena asked, turning away from the window as more unmarked vehicles arrived at the medical station. Harrison's expression grew serious in ways that suggested complications Elena hadn't anticipated. "Cross's capture has triggered responses from his network that we didn't fully expect. His failure to complete the transaction has exposed vulnerabilities in their operation, and they're moving to protect assets that include people in positions of significant authority." Elena felt the familiar chill of realization that accompanied discovering she was involved in something far more complex than originally presented. "How significant?" "Pentagon level," Harrison said quietly. Cross wasn't operating independently. He was part of a network that includes current military personnel with access to classified Arctic operations. His arrest has forced them to accelerate plans that were supposed to unfold over months. Elena walked to the coffee machine, needing something to do with her hands while processing the implications of what Harrison was telling her. She'd assumed that capturing Cross would end her involvement in whatever intelligence operation had brought him to Alaska. Instead, she was learning that his arrest had been only the opening move in a much larger game. "You want me to stay involved," Elena said, understanding the direction Harrison's briefing was heading. Harrison consulted his tablet again, scrolling through intelligence reports that carried classification levels Elena hadn't seen during her military career. Cross's network is planning to extract remaining assets using aircraft and routes that require Arctic flying capabilities beyond normal military standards. They need pilots with your specific skill set, and they're going to try to recruit you. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "They just lost their inside man because I helped you capture him. Why would they trust me with anything?" "Because they don't know you helped capture him," Harrison explained. "Our intelligence suggests they believe Cross was arrested during a random traffic stop while attempting to reach his extraction point. They think his pilot never arrived, leaving them without reliable transportation for their final extraction." Elena understood immediately what Harrison was proposing. Cross's network would approach her, believing she was an unconnected civilian pilot who could be hired for what appeared to be legitimate charter work. She would accept their contract, then deliver them to locations where Defense Intelligence Agency personnel could arrest the remaining conspirators. "Another trap," Elena said, remembering her conversation with Harrison before Cross's capture. "Multiple traps," Harrison corrected. "This network includes at least 6 individuals with access to different aspects of Arctic military operations. We have to get them all at once," Harrison said. "If any escape, they'll vanish into foreign intelligence networks and keep leaking American secrets." Elena poured herself a coffee, her hand steady despite the enormity of what Harrison was proposing. In the military, her missions had been straightforward, clear goals, clear parameters. But this sounded like something else entirely. A deep cover operation requiring her to adopt a false identity, move between enemy operatives, and navigate murky alliances where friend and foe were hard to distinguish. "What makes you think I'm qualified for this?" she asked. "I'm a pilot, not a spy." Harrison offered a knowing smile, clearly expecting the pushback. "Cross's network uses pilots who can fly when no one else can. You've made a name for yourself flying missions that most wouldn't even attempt. That makes you the perfect candidate for the kind of extractions they rely on." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the kind of manipulative undertone she'd encountered during her time with Operation Clearwater. But what she saw was respect, and a full understanding of the danger he was asking her to step into. "How many people have died because of them?" she asked. Harrison's voice dropped, weighed down by grim reality. 17 U.S. service members over the past year and a half. All killed on missions compromised by intel leaked through Cross's network. 3 of them were Arctic rescue pilots ambushed during extractions that were supposed to be secure. The numbers hit hard. 17 dead because someone had sold them out. 3 pilots like her, dying in the line of duty because enemies knew exactly when and where they'd be. Elena turned to the window. Outside, medical staff were preparing gear more than what was needed for Tommy, who was now stable. It was a quiet reminder that these operations didn't just affect the operatives involved. They rippled outward, impacting families and communities who might never know why their loved ones never came home. "If I agree to this," Elena said, her voice low and firm, "I want full autonomy. No oversight, no trackers, no interference. I make contact when and how I choose. I deliver them based on my own tactical judgment." Harrison didn't hesitate. "Understood. But make no mistake, these people are killers. If they suspect even the hint of a setup, they won't hesitate." Elena turned back, her expression shifting into the cool, controlled intensity that had made her one of the most trusted rescue pilots in Arctic operations. "Colonel, I've spent over 10 years flying into war zones and pulling people out. These operatives are about to learn something the hard way. Some pilots don't scare easy. And some of us don't stop until the ones responsible for American deaths are held accountable." At that moment, Dr. Reed appeared in the doorway, his expression one of quiet relief. "Tommy's awake. He's asking for the pilot who saved him." Elena followed him to the boy's room. Tommy was propped up in bed, color returning to his cheeks. His mother, Lisa Brennan, stood beside him, gratitude in her eyes as she reached out and squeezed Elena's hand. "Are you really a pilot?" Tommy asked, his voice weak but filled with childlike wonder. "Mom says you flew through a storm to save me." Elena sat next to his bed, the weight of Harrison's request still heavy in her thoughts. She looked at the boy, the kind of innocent life people like Cross were willing to sacrifice without a second thought. "I am," she said softly. "And I was glad I could help. How are you feeling?" Tommy thought about it for a moment, clearly taking the question seriously. "Better. Dr. Reed says I was really sick, but I'm gonna be okay now. Are you going to keep flying and helping people?" Elena looked into his hopeful face, sensing the decision before her: continue the peaceful life she'd built, or accept the mission that would drag her back into the shadows. Cross's network had targeted this child to manipulate her instincts. They'd gambled that she'd respond exactly the way she had. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm going to keep helping people." Tommy smiled with the full, unquestioning trust only a child can give. "That's good. Mom says there aren't enough people who help when things get scary." Elena spent another hour with Tommy and his mother, listening to stories about their life in the remote valley and their gratitude for medical care that had saved their son's life. But her mind was already working through the tactical challenges of Harrison's proposed operation. analyzing the kind of intelligence work that would be required to identify and capture Cross's remaining network. When she finally left Tommy's room, Elena found Harrison waiting with operational details that confirmed her decision to accept his mission. The intelligence files contained photographs and biographical information about 6 individuals whose betrayal of American military secrets had resulted in the deaths of people Elena might have served alongside during her own military career. "When do they make contact?" Elena asked, studying faces that belonged to people who'd chosen money over loyalty to their country and their fellow service members. "Within 48 hours, Harrison said. "Our communications intercepts suggest they're desperate to complete extractions before we can identify and arrest additional network members. They need a pilot immediately, and your reputation makes you their best available option." Elena nodded, understanding that the next phase of the operation would require her to maintain perfect operational security while navigating between hostile intelligence operatives and friendly forces that she couldn't always identify. It was exactly the kind of complex mission that had appealed to her during her military career, challenging her skills while serving causes that mattered. But as Elena prepared to leave Kodiak Medical Station and return to her cover identity as a civilian bush pilot, she realized that this operation would test more than her flying abilities. Cross's network had demonstrated their willingness to target innocent civilians to achieve tactical objectives. Elena's participation in their capture would place her permanently on the radar of intelligence services that viewed witnesses as security risks requiring elimination. The quiet life she'd built in Whitehorse Creek was about to end, regardless of how successfully she completed Harrison's mission. Once she chose to fight against people who sold American secrets to hostile nations, there would be no returning to the anonymous existence she'd enjoyed for 5 years. Elena walked back to Tommy's room for one final visit before departing. The boy was sleeping peacefully, his breathing regular, and his color healthy. Lisa Brennan looked up from her chair beside the bed, smiling with the exhausted relief of someone whose world had been saved by the courage of others. "Thank you," Lisa whispered, "for everything." Elena squeezed Lisa's shoulder, understanding that she was saying goodbye to more than just grateful patience. She was saying goodbye to the version of herself that could walk away from injustice if it meant protecting her own peace of mind. The network that had poisoned Tommy to manipulate her was about to discover that some people couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and couldn't be stopped once they decided that justice mattered more than safety. Elena Vasquez was about to become someone far more dangerous than the quiet bush pilot who'd spent 5 years avoiding her past. The approach came exactly as Harrison had predicted, but through channels Elena hadn't expected. Instead of direct contact through aviation frequencies or charter service inquiries, the network reached out through Dr. Reed at the medical clinic. The message was simple and appeared completely legitimate. A medical research team needed immediate evacuation from a remote site where their helicopter had suffered mechanical failure. Elena was reviewing maintenance schedules in her hangar when Dr. Reed called with the request, his voice carrying the professional urgency that characterized genuine medical emergencies. "Elena, I just received a call from Dr. Patricia Wells at the Arctic Research Institute. They have a team stranded at a biological survey site, and their pilot developed altitude sickness that prevents him from flying. They need immediate extraction." Elena consulted her aviation charts, noting that the coordinates Dr. Reed provided were located in terrain that would challenge even experienced Arctic pilots. The site was accessible only by aircraft, surrounded by mountains that created unpredictable wind patterns and far enough from civilization that mechanical problems would become survival situations. "What's the medical situation?" Elena asked, maintaining her cover as a pilot whose primary concern was passenger safety rather than tactical complications. Dr. Reed's response carried the careful neutrality that suggested he was reading from prepared text. 5 researchers, no immediate medical emergencies, but weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. They need extraction within the next 8 hours, or they'll be stranded until spring. Elena understood immediately that Cross's network was using exactly the kind of humanitarian cover story that would appeal to her reputation for flying emergency missions in impossible conditions. They'd studied her operational history carefully, enough to know that she would prioritize civilian safety over personal risk, even when the mission parameters seemed suspicious. "I can be airborne in 30 minutes, Elena said, beginning her pre-flight preparations, while Harrison monitored the conversation from his concealed position in the hangar. After ending the call with Dr. Reed, Elena turned to Harrison with the cold smile of someone who just committed to a course of action that couldn't be reversed. "They're using medical cover stories, probably hoping that my humanitarian reputation will override any suspicions about their real objectives." Harrison consulted his tactical displays, showing satellite coverage of the coordinates where Elena would meet Cross's network. "Our intelligence suggests this is their primary extraction point, with transportation arranged to move them across the Canadian border once they reach international airspace." Elena nodded, understanding the political constraints that made this operation time-sensitive. Once Cross's network reached Canadian territory, their arrest would require diplomatic negotiations that could take months while they disappeared into foreign intelligence services. The flight to the supposed research site took Elena through some of the most spectacular wilderness in North America, but her attention was focused on the tactical situation developing ahead. Cross's network had chosen their extraction point carefully, selecting terrain that would limit official response capabilities while providing multiple escape routes if their original plan failed. As Elena approached the coordinates, she could see a helicopter on the ground that appeared to have suffered the mechanical failure described by Dr. Reed, but her military training allowed her to recognize details that suggested deception. The aircraft was positioned too perfectly for a forced landing, and the supposed researchers were waiting with equipment that looked more like intelligence materials than biological survey instruments. Elena keyed her radio on the frequency Harrison was monitoring, transmitting the coded message that indicated she was beginning the final phase of the operation. "Phoenix Base, November 7-4 Victor approaching survey site. Passengers appear ready for immediate departure." Harrison's response was immediate and professional. "November 7-4 Victor, cleared to proceed. Recovery team standing by." Elena landed on a makeshift strip that had been carved from the wilderness with military precision, noting that the site's construction required equipment and expertise beyond what civilian research teams normally possessed. The supposed Dr. Patricia Wells approached her aircraft with 5 companions whose movements suggested combat training rather than academic backgrounds. "Captain Vasquez," Dr. Wells said, using Elena's former military rank in a way that confirmed she was part of Cross's intelligence network. "Thank you for responding so quickly. We have sensitive research materials that need to reach laboratory facilities immediately." Elena accepted the equipment cases while scanning the team for weapons and communication devices that would reveal their true purpose. All 6 individuals carried gear that suggested they were prepared for situations far more dangerous than biological research, confirming Harrison's intelligence about their espionage activities. "Where are we headed?" Elena asked, settling into the pilot's seat while the network members secured themselves for departure. Dr. Wells handed Elena a GPS coordinate display showing a location near the Canadian border, exactly where Harrison had predicted they would attempt their extraction. "Private airfield, very discreet operation. The people we're meeting prefer to avoid official attention." Elena programmed the coordinates into her navigation system while noting that Dr. Wells was monitoring multiple communication devices, suggesting coordination with personnel who weren't visible at the extraction site. The operation was larger and more complex than Cross's individual case, involving resources that indicated foreign intelligence support. The takeoff proceeded normally, with the network members apparently confident about their extraction plan. But Elena was subtly altering course toward the coordinates Harrison had provided for their arrest, using weather considerations to mask the deviation until it became too obvious to explain away. 20 minutes into the flight, Dr. Wells began studying the terrain below with the attention of someone who recognized they weren't following the most direct route to their destination. Her expression showed growing suspicion as she compared Elena's navigation display to her own GPS device. "Captain Vasquez," Dr. Wells said carefully, "this route doesn't match our flight plan calculations." Elena maintained her professional pilot voice while feeling tension building in the cabin. "Weather radar is showing severe turbulence along the direct route. I'm taking us around the worst of it to ensure passenger safety." Dr. Wells consulted her communication devices, apparently receiving updates that increased her suspicions about Elena's routing decisions. The other network members were becoming alert in ways that suggested they were preparing for complications beyond normal aviation emergencies. "I need you to change course to the original heading immediately," Dr. Wells said, her voice carrying authority that belonged to intelligence operations rather than medical research. "Our schedule doesn't allow for weather delays." Elena realized that the moment of decision had arrived sooner than anticipated. She could continue the deception and hope to reach Harrison's interception point before the network realized they were being led into a trap, or she could reveal her knowledge of their activities and force a confrontation at altitude. "I can't do that, Dr. Wells," Elena said quietly, allowing her voice to carry the steel that had once made her one of the military's most feared rescue pilots. "You're not going to complete your extraction. You're going to answer for the American service members who died because of the intelligence you sold." The network's reaction was immediate and coordinated, confirming Elena's assessment that these were professional intelligence operatives rather than civilian researchers. But Elena had anticipated exactly this response, and her countermeasures were faster and more decisive than they had expected. The struggle in the cabin lasted only seconds, but it occurred at 10,000 feet in an aircraft that required constant pilot attention to remain airborne. Elena managed to maintain control while the network members discovered that their supposed civilian pilot was far more dangerous than they had calculated. As Elena secured the network members with restraints she'd prepared specifically for this possibility, she keyed her radio to broadcast on the emergency frequency Harrison was monitoring. "Phoenix Base, this is November 7-4 Victor. All packages secured, requesting immediate vector to pickup point." Harrison's response carried the satisfaction of someone whose complex operation was proceeding exactly as planned. "November 7-4 Victor, turn right heading 090, maintain current altitude. Friendly aircraft will intercept in 10 minutes. The interception with Harrison's aircraft occurred with military precision, with helicopters taking custody of Cross's network and their classified materials while Elena continued to a secure airfield where she could be debriefed about intelligence gathered during the operation. But as Elena landed at the government facility, she realized that her role in dismantling Cross's espionage network had changed her status in ways that would affect the rest of her life. She was no longer a civilian pilot who'd been recruited for a single mission. She was someone who'd proven capable of complex intelligence operations against hostile foreign services. Harrison was waiting at the debriefing facility with the kind of smile that suggested new missions rather than operational conclusions. "Excellent work, Captain. The network you captured represents the most significant counterintelligence success we've achieved in Arctic operations." Elena studied Harrison's expression, recognizing the look of someone who was about to propose additional assignments that would draw her deeper into the intelligence world she'd spent 5 years avoiding. "This was a one-time operation, Colonel. I'm going back to civilian life." Harrison's smile widened with the confidence of someone who understood motivations better than the people who held them. "I think you'll find that's no longer an option. Cross's network was part of a larger operation that includes assets we haven't identified yet. They know you were responsible for their capture, and they're going to come looking for revenge." Elena felt the familiar chill of realization that accompanied discovering she was trapped in a situation with no good exits. By choosing to help capture Cross's network, she'd made enemies of intelligence services that viewed witnesses as security risks requiring elimination. The quiet life she'd built in Whitehorse Creek was over, regardless of what choices she made next. Elena Vasquez, bush pilot, was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone whose existence was defined by the shadow war between competing intelligence services. The real battle was just beginning, and Elena was no longer sure which side would be left standing when it ended. Elena stood in the secure debriefing room watching surveillance footage of her own aircraft as intelligence analysts dissected every moment of the operation that had captured Cross's network. The video showed her Beaver approaching the fake research site, the tense moments during passenger loading, and the aerial struggle that had ended with 6 espionage operatives in federal custody. But what disturbed Elena most was the professional satisfaction in Harrison's voice as he reviewed tactical details that suggested this operation had been designed to test her capabilities for future missions. "The network you captured was selling more than Arctic warfare protocols," Harrison said. Consulting classified files that carried security markings Elena had never seen during her military career. They were providing real-time intelligence about American rescue operations to hostile forces who used that information to plan ambushes. Every medical evacuation, every emergency extraction, every search and rescue mission in the Arctic region was potentially compromised. Elena felt the weight of that information settling over her like Arctic wind. During her military career, she'd flown dozens of rescue missions into hostile territory, trusting that her flight plans and operational details were protected by layers of military security. Learning that those same details had been sold to enemies who could use them to kill American service members was a betrayal that went beyond professional misconduct into something approaching treason. "How long had this been going on?" Elena asked, studying photographs of the captured network members, who'd maintained their cover as medical researchers until the moment she'd revealed their true situation. Harrison scrolled through intelligence reports that painted a picture of systematic espionage spanning several years. At least 3 years, possibly longer. Cross's network had access to classified databases that allowed them to predict American military activities across the entire polar region. They were selling that information to buyers who included terrorist organizations, hostile nations, and criminal enterprises with interests in Arctic resources. Elena walked to the window overlooking the secure airfield where her Beaver sat. Surrounded by military vehicles and personnel conducting forensic analysis of every surface the network members had touched. The sight reminded her that her aircraft had become evidence in a counterintelligence operation that would generate consequences extending far beyond the immediate arrests. What happens to the people who died because of what they sold? Elena asked, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd seen too many good people killed by betrayal. Harrison's expression grew somber with the weight of casualties that couldn't be discussed in detail due to classification restrictions. Their families have been told they died serving their country in operations that remain classified for national security reasons. The truth about how their missions were compromised will never be officially acknowledged. Elena understood the political necessity of maintaining operational security, but the human cost of protecting classified methods felt like a second betrayal of the people who died trusting that their government would safeguard the information that determined whether they lived or died during dangerous missions. The door to the debriefing room opened to admit a woman Elena didn't recognize, someone whose bearing suggested authority beyond Harrison's rank. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and the kind of composed presence that indicated decades of experience making decisions that affected national security policy. "Captain Vasquez," the woman said, settling into a chair across from Elena with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I'm Deputy Director Sarah Mitchell, Defense Intelligence Agency. I wanted to personally thank you for your exceptional work in dismantling this espionage network." Elena studied Mitchell's face, recognizing the look of someone who was about to make an offer that would change the fundamental direction of her life. "I'm not Captain anything anymore, ma'am. I'm a civilian pilot who helped solve a specific problem. My involvement in this operation is finished." Mitchell smiled with the expression of someone who'd anticipated exactly this response. "I'm afraid that's no longer possible. Cross's network was part of a larger operation that includes assets we haven't identified yet. Their capture has triggered responses from foreign intelligence services that view you as either a valuable recruitment target or a security threat requiring elimination." Elena felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a situation with no good exits, the same feeling that had ended her military career during Operation Clearwater. "What kind of responses?" Mitchell consulted her own classified tablet, scrolling through intelligence reports that suggested Elena's situation was more dangerous than she'd realized. At least 3 foreign intelligence services have tasked assets with either recruiting you for their own operations or eliminating you to prevent further damage to their networks. Your identity, location, and operational capabilities are now known to people who view American intelligence assets as legitimate targets. Elena walked back to the window, watching technicians examine her aircraft with the thoroughness that suggested they were looking for tracking devices or other surveillance equipment that might have been planted during the operation. The sight reminded her that her participation in capturing Cross's network had made her a permanent target of intelligence services that operated without regard for civilian status or international law. "You're offering me protection in exchange for continued service," Elena said, understanding the bargain that Mitchell was proposing. Mitchell nodded with the directness of someone who'd learned that indirect approaches wasted time that couldn't be recovered. "We're offering you the opportunity to continue serving your country in operations that require your unique combination of aviation skills and operational experience. In exchange, you receive the protection and support of the Defense Intelligence Agency." Elena considered the offer while watching her Beaver being prepared for transport to a secure facility, where it would be modified with equipment that would transform it from a civilian charter aircraft into something capable of supporting intelligence operations in hostile territory. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Accepting Mitchell's offer would require the same kind of transformation of her own identity. "What kind of operations?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mitchell's response confirmed Elena's expectations while revealing the scope of what she was being recruited to support. Arctic intelligence operations require pilots who can operate in conditions that ground normal aircraft. Your reputation for flying impossible missions in deadly weather makes you invaluable for assignments that conventional military assets can't handle. Elena understood immediately what Mitchell wasn't saying explicitly. The Defense Intelligence Agency needed someone who could extract assets from hostile territory, deliver personnel to locations where normal military presence would create diplomatic complications, and conduct surveillance missions that required civilian cover identities. "Spy flights," Elena said bluntly. Mitchell's smile widened with appreciation for Elena's direct assessment. "Intelligence-gathering missions that serve American national security interests while maintaining plausible deniability for official government involvement." Elena returned to her chair, feeling the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. During her military career, she'd flown missions with clear objectives and defined parameters, serving causes that were explicitly connected to protecting American lives and interests. What Mitchell was describing sounded like operations that existed in the gray areas between legitimate military action and activities that required congressional oversight. "What about my life in Alaska?" Elena asked. "My business, my reputation. In the community, the relationships I've built over 5 years?" Mitchell's expression grew sympathetic, but her voice remained firm. "Elena Vasquez, bush pilot and entrepreneur, died in an aircraft accident during a weather-related emergency. The official investigation will conclude that she was killed while attempting a rescue mission in impossible conditions. Exactly the kind of heroic death that fits her reputation." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic climate outside the secure facility. Mitchell was describing the complete erasure of the identity she'd spent 5 years constructing, replacing it with something that existed only within the classified world of intelligence operations. "And the people in Whitehorse Creek?" Elena asked, thinking of the families who depended on her for transportation, medical evacuations, and connection to the outside world. Mitchell consulted her tablet again, scrolling through files that suggested the Defense Intelligence Agency had already planned for Elena's transition into their organization. "Another pilot will be assigned to cover your routes, someone with similar capabilities, but without the complications of your operational history. The community will continue to receive the services they need." Elena understood that Mitchell was offering her a choice between death and rebirth, between the quiet life she'd built and the dangerous missions that had once defined her purpose. But the choice was complicated by the knowledge that refusing Mitchell's offer would leave her vulnerable to foreign intelligence services that viewed her as either an asset to be recruited or a threat to be eliminated. "How do I know you won't use me the same way Cross used Tommy Brennan?" Elena asked. "How do I know this isn't just a more sophisticated form of manipulation?" Mitchell's response carried the weight of someone who'd wrestled with similar moral questions throughout her own career. "Because you'll have operational autonomy that Cross's network never allowed their assets. You choose which missions to accept, you determine tactical parameters, and you maintain veto authority over any operation that compromises your principles." Elena studied Mitchell's face, looking for signs of the deception that had characterized her interactions with intelligence agencies during Operation Clearwater. But Mitchell's expression suggested genuine respect for Elena's capabilities combined with understanding of the ethical constraints that had ended her military career. "What about accountability?" Elena asked. "Who ensures that the missions I fly serve legitimate American interests rather than political convenience or personal advancement?" Mitchell smiled with appreciation for Elena's questions, recognizing the careful analysis that had made her effective during complex rescue operations. Congressional oversight, judicial review when operations affect American citizens, and internal auditing by personnel who understand the difference between necessary secrecy and criminal conspiracy. Elena walked back to the window one final time, watching her aircraft being prepared for a transformation that would mirror her own transition from civilian pilot to intelligence operative. The Beaver had served her faithfully for 5 years, carrying supplies and people across some of the most dangerous terrain in North America. Soon it would be modified with equipment that would allow it to support missions that officially didn't exist. "There's one more thing you should know," Mitchell said quietly. "Tommy Brennan is asking for you." His mother called the medical station, wanting to thank the pilot who saved her son's life. She doesn't know that Elena Vasquez is about to disappear forever. Elena felt the emotional weight of that information pressing against her resolve. Tommy represented everything she'd chosen to protect by building a quiet life in Alaska innocent. People who needed help without political complications or hidden agendas. His recovery had validated her decision to prioritize civilian safety over intelligence operations. But Tommy had also been poisoned by people who viewed child welfare as acceptable collateral damage in their espionage activities. Cross's network had calculated that Elena's protective instincts would place her exactly where they needed her to be, demonstrating the kind of systematic cruelty that required response beyond normal legal channels. "I want to see him one more time," Elena said finally, "before Elena Vasquez dies in an aircraft accident." Mitchell nodded with understanding that suggested she'd anticipated this request. "We can arrange that. But after you leave Kodiak Medical Station, Elena Vasquez ceases to exist. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Elena looked at her reflection in the window, seeing a woman who'd spent 5 years trying to escape a past that had finally caught up with her. The quiet bush pilot who'd fixed engines and flew supply runs was about to be replaced by someone whose existence was defined by missions that couldn't be acknowledged and enemies who would never stop hunting her. "Yes," Elena said quietly, understanding that she was choosing justice over safety, purpose over peace. "I'm ready." The flight back to Kodiak Medical Station took place in a military helicopter that carried no identification markings, with Elena wearing civilian clothes that would allow her to maintain her cover identity for one final visit. But her mind was already working through the tactical challenges of the intelligence missions Mitchell had described, analyzing the kind of flying that would be required to extract assets from hostile territory. As the helicopter approached the medical station, Elena could see Tommy Brennan playing in the facility's courtyard with the energy of someone whose brush with death had been completely overcome by modern medicine and skillful surgery. Lisa Brennan sat nearby, watching her son with the protective attention of someone who understood how quickly normal life could become life-threatening emergency. Elena spent an hour with Tommy and his mother, listening to stories about their plans to return to their remote valley and their gratitude for medical care that had saved their family. But she couldn't tell them that their story had been part of a larger operation that had cost lives across multiple continents, or that the pilot who'd saved Tommy was about to disappear forever. "Will we see you again?" Tommy asked as Elena prepared to leave, his voice carrying the innocent assumption that good people remained available when they were needed. Elena smiled with genuine warmth while feeling the weight of a lie that was necessary for everyone's protection. "I'll always be around when people need help, even if you don't see me." As Elena walked away from Kodiak Medical Station for the final time, she understood that she was saying goodbye to more than just grateful patients. She was saying goodbye to the version of herself that could choose simple problems over complex missions, personal safety over national security, and peaceful anonymity over dangerous purpose. Elena Vasquez, bush pilot, died that afternoon in an aircraft accident that was reported with the kind of heroic details that honored her reputation for flying impossible missions in deadly conditions. Her memorial service was attended by everyone in Whitehorse Creek who depended on her courage and competence, and her aircraft was officially listed as destroyed in the same storm that claimed her life. But someone else walked away from that memorial service, someone whose identity existed only in classified files and whose missions would be remembered only by people with security clearances that couldn't be discussed. The woman who'd once been Elena Vasquez was about to begin a new kind of flying, serving causes that mattered while operating in shadows that would protect both her identity and the people she'd chosen to defend. The transformation was complete, and the real mission was about to begin. 6 months later, a woman who carried no identification and flew aircraft that appeared on no registry landed at a remote airstrip in northern Canada where 3 American intelligence assets waited for extraction from a mission that had gone wrong. The pilot's face was unfamiliar to official databases, but her flying demonstrated the kind of skill that belonged to legends whispered about in classified briefings. "Who are you?" one of the assets asked as they climbed aboard the unmarked aircraft that would carry them to safety. The pilot smiled with the confidence of someone who'd found her true purpose after years of searching for it in the wrong places. "I'm someone who brings people home when everyone else says it's impossible." As the aircraft lifted off into conditions, That would have grounded any normal pilot. The woman who'd once been Elena Vasquez felt the familiar satisfaction of flying missions that mattered. She was no longer hiding from her past or avoiding her destiny. She was exactly where she belonged, serving causes greater than herself while using skills that had been honed by years of impossible flights in deadly conditions. The quiet bush pilot was gone forever, replaced by someone whose existence was defined by missions that saved lives and served justice in a world where both were constantly under threat. Elena had found her way back to the sky, and this time she was flying. On her own terms. The legend of the ghost pilot who appeared when missions became impossible was just beginning, and the people who needed rescue would never know her name. But they would know that someone was watching, someone was flying, and someone would always come when death seemed certain and hope seemed lost. In the vast wilderness where borders were just lines on maps and survival depended on courage rather than politics, the woman who'd once saved a poisoned child was now saving a world that would never know her sacrifice. She'd chosen purpose over peace, and the sky would never be the same. 3 years had passed since Elena Vasquez officially died in an aircraft accident over the Alaska wilderness. But the legend of the ghost pilot had grown far beyond what any intelligence agency could have planned or controlled. In remote corners of the Arctic where official rescue services couldn't reach, people spoke in whispers about a mysterious aviator who appeared during impossible situations, extracted personnel from certain death, and vanished without leaving traces that could be tracked by satellite surveillance or government databases. The woman who bore no official name sat in the cockpit of her latest aircraft, a heavily modified Twin Otter that had been rebuilt with technology that existed decades ahead of anything available to civilian operators. She was monitoring encrypted communications from a temporary base carved into the Greenland ice sheet, 300 miles from the nearest human settlement, listening to distress calls that would never receive official response due to political complications that made rescue operations diplomatically impossible. Mayday, mayday. This is research vessel Arctic Pioneer. The transmission crackled through atmospheric interference that made communication difficult even with her advanced RADIO equipment. We have suffered catastrophic hull breach in pack ice approximately 40 miles northeast of Ellesmere Island. 8 souls on board, taking on water faster than pumps can manage. Request immediate assistance. The woman checked her navigation displays, calculating flight time to the coordinates where Arctic Pioneer was broadcasting its distress call. The research vessel was operating in international waters that had become a flashpoint for territorial disputes between multiple nations, meaning that official rescue operations would require diplomatic negotiations that could take days while people died from exposure in water that would kill them within minutes. She keyed her radio on a frequency that would reach the vessel without revealing her position to monitoring stations operated by intelligence services that were still hunting for the pilot who disrupted their operations 3 years earlier. Arctic Pioneer, this is civilian aircraft operating in your area. What is your current status and passenger condition? The response came immediately, carrying the controlled desperation of someone who understood that rescue was unlikely through normal channels. Civilian aircraft, we have approximately 30 minutes before complete hull failure. 4 passengers showing signs of hypothermia, 2 with injuries from impact with ice flow. Captain is attempting to beach vessel on ice shelf, but structural damage is too severe. The woman was already performing pre-flight checks as she processed the tactical situation developing at the coordinates Arctic Pioneer had provided. Pack ice conditions in that region were notoriously unstable, with pressure ridges and open water that could trap aircraft or make landing impossible. Weather reports showed deteriorating conditions with visibility dropping and winds increasing to levels that would challenge even her extensively modified aircraft. But 8 people were dying in one of the most remote and dangerous regions on Earth, And she'd spent 3 years building a reputation for appearing when official rescue services said situations were hopeless. The moral calculation was simple. Even if the flying would test every skill she'd developed during more than a decade of Arctic operations, she lifted off from her ice runway into conditions that would have grounded commercial aviation anywhere in the world, climbing through turbulence that shook even her reinforced airframe while monitoring weather updates that suggested the storm system was intensifying faster than meteorologists had predicted. The Twin Otter responded to her control inputs with the precision of an aircraft that had been rebuilt, specifically for operations in impossible conditions. 20 minutes into the flight, her encrypted radio received a transmission on frequencies that belonged to intelligence operations rather than civilian emergency services. The voice was unfamiliar, but the authority was unmistakable and carried undertones that suggested she was flying into a situation more complex than a simple maritime rescue. Ghost pilot, this is Arctic Control. Vessel you're approaching is carrying classified research materials stolen from American facilities. Recommend you abort rescue mission and return to base immediately. The woman smiled grimly as she continued toward Arctic Pioneer's coordinates, recognizing the kind of political interference that had complicated rescue operations throughout her career. Intelligence agencies were apparently willing to let people die rather than risk classified materials falling into the wrong hands, demonstrating the same callous calculation that had once led to Tommy Brennan being poisoned to create tactical advantages. Arctic Control, this is civilian aircraft. Responding to maritime distress call, she transmitted back. My passengers' lives take priority over your operational security concerns. The response carried the edge of someone accustomed to having orders followed without question. Ghost pilot, those materials represent threats to national security that outweigh individual casualties. You are ordered to abort this mission. The woman switched off her radio communications with Arctic Control while maintaining contact with Arctic Pioneer, understanding that she was about to conduct a rescue operation against the explicit orders of intelligence services that viewed human lives as acceptable losses when weighed against classified operations. As she approached the coordinates where Arctic Pioneer was broadcasting its distress call, she could see the research vessel trapped in pack ice that was crushing its hull with pressure that would completely destroy the ship within minutes. The crew had managed to reach an ice flow that appeared marginally stable, but exposure to Arctic temperatures would kill them long before official rescue services could organize extraction missions. The landing on pack ice required skills that belonged more to test pilots than rescue aviators, with the woman threading her Twin Otter between pressure ridges, while calculating weight distribution that would prevent the ice from cracking under her aircraft's impact. She touched down on a strip barely longer than her landing requirements, immediately beginning the process of loading survivors who were already showing signs of severe hypothermia. Who are you? Asked Dr. James Crawford, the expedition leader whose research materials had apparently triggered intelligence agency interest in preventing their rescue. We've been calling for help for hours, but everyone said weather conditions made rescue impossible. The woman helped load injured passengers while checking vital signs that indicated several team members needed immediate medical attention that only existed at facilities hundreds of miles away. I'm someone who doesn't think weather conditions are more important than human lives. As she prepared for takeoff with 8 additional passengers aboard an aircraft that was now operating beyond its normal weight limitations, her radio crackled, with transmissions that suggested Arctic Control was coordinating interference with her rescue mission. Military aircraft were apparently being scrambled to intercept her flight, with orders to prevent classified materials from reaching destinations beyond government control. The takeoff from pack ice tested every modification that had been made to her Twin Otter, with the aircraft struggling to achieve flying speed while carrying passengers whose medical condition required immediate attention. But the woman had spent years learning to extract maximum performance from aircraft operating in impossible conditions, and the Twin Otter responded to her touch with the reliability of equipment that had been maintained beyond factory specifications. 30 minutes into the return flight, her aircraft was intercepted by military helicopters, whose pilots were broadcasting orders for her to land at government facilities where the research materials and passengers could be transferred to official custody. The helicopters were armed and positioned in ways that suggested their orders included authority to use force if she refused to comply with their directions. Unknown aircraft, this is Falcon Leader. You are ordered to follow us to secure airfield at Thule Air Base for customs inspection and passenger processing. The woman keyed her radio while adjusting course toward a destination that existed only in her navigation computer. Coordinates where Dr. Crawford's research team could receive medical attention without being interrogated by intelligence agencies about materials they'd recovered during their Arctic expedition. Falcon Leader, I have medical emergencies aboard requiring immediate hospitalization. My passengers need treatment, not interrogation. The military helicopter's response carried the finality of someone whose orders didn't allow for negotiation. Unknown aircraft, you will comply with interception orders or we will be forced to disable your aircraft. Lives lost due to your failure to comply will be your responsibility. The woman understood that she was facing the same moral calculation that had defined her transition from civilian pilot to intelligence operative. Military helicopters were threatening to shoot down an aircraft carrying injured civilians because government agencies prioritized control over classified materials above human welfare. But 3 years of flying missions that officially didn't exist had taught her that some fights were worth accepting regardless of the odds. Intelligence agencies that were willing to let research teams die to protect operational security represented exactly the kind of institutional callousness that she'd chosen to oppose when she'd accepted Deputy Director Mitchell's offer. The aerial chase that followed tested skills that belonged to combat aviation rather than rescue operations, with the woman using weather conditions and terrain features to evade military helicopters whose pilots weren't trained for the kind of low-altitude flying that had become her specialty. Her Twin Otter shouldn't have been able to outmaneuver military aircraft, but modifications that officially didn't exist had given her capabilities that surprised even the pilots trying to intercept her. 2 hours later, she landed at a civilian medical facility that had been established by international humanitarian organizations specifically to serve Arctic research teams, without regard for political complications that might prevent official assistance. Dr. Crawford's expedition members received immediate treatment while the research materials they'd recovered remained in their possession rather than being confiscated by intelligence agencies. How do we thank someone who doesn't officially exist? Dr. Crawford asked as his team was transferred to medical facilities that would ensure their complete recovery. The woman smiled while preparing for departure, understanding that gratitude from people she'd rescued was the only reward that mattered in work that would never be officially acknowledged. You don't thank me. You use whatever you discovered out there to help people, and you remember that someone will always come when rescue seems impossible. As she lifted off into Arctic darkness that provided cover from surveillance systems, still searching for the ghost pilot, the woman felt the familiar satisfaction of completing missions that served human welfare rather than political convenience. Intelligence agencies would continue hunting for her. Foreign services would continue trying to recruit or eliminate her. But none of that mattered compared to the knowledge that 8 people were alive because she'd chosen their welfare over operational orders. The radio in her cockpit crackled with a transmission on frequencies that very few people knew existed. A communication from the only person whose approval still mattered to her professional pride. Outstanding work as always. The research materials you helped rescue contained evidence of climate manipulation technologies that could affect Arctic weather patterns. Intelligence agencies wanted to classify that information to prevent public disclosure of environmental warfare capabilities. Deputy Director Mitchell's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose faith in Elena's abilities had been validated by 3 years of impossible missions, accomplished without official support or recognition. Your passengers are safe there. Research will be published through channels that ensure proper scientific review, and you've reminded various intelligence services that some operations can't be controlled through political pressure. The woman who'd once been Elena Vasquez adjusted course toward her next temporary base, a location that would remain secret until her services were needed by people whose lives depended on someone willing to fly when everyone else said conditions were impossible. She'd found her true purpose in the years since leaving civilian life behind, serving causes that mattered while operating beyond the reach of bureaucrats who viewed human lives as acceptable losses in larger political games, the ghost pilots. Legend would continue growing with each impossible rescue. Each mission that proved courage could overcome conditions that defeated normal operations. In the vast Arctic wilderness where survival depended on skill rather than politics, where rescue meant the difference between life and death rather than diplomatic advantage, someone was always watching and always ready to fly when hope seemed lost. The woman who'd once saved a poisoned child had become someone who saved a world that would never know her sacrifice. But she knew, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.